Television, the drug of the nation. This is really the main shackle that's wrapped around us. Because remember, we live in an age where consciousness is the playground, where consciousness is the battlefield, where consciousness is where everything is to play for, and it's been like that for a very long time. But television became their ultimate weapon to penetrate into the human psyche, to go to those underlying poles of cognitive awareness and to make us into something that we think we should be. They become the conduit for the TV man, for telly man, to change us according to his will, to cause change in conformity with will, to alter and manipulate us. And telly man is very powerful, and he's more powerful in some cultures than he is in others. And where telly man was extremely powerful was in Britain in the late 1970s and the 1980s, when there was very few channels before multi-channel TV, and the BBC in particular controlled the perceptions. They were, as I said in my last book, the Lords of Perceptions. As I said in my last book, The Amble of the Psyche. They were the ultimate Lords of Perception. They were literally the King's Regent, or the King's Regiment. Regiment really means the mind of the King. The BBC has never changed, but they don't have the same power they used to. But they still have tremendous power. And they still lack decency. They don't entertain, they indoctrinate. In recent times, and I know I'm talking to an international audience here, so I'll go into the background details, so I don't mean to bore people on these islands, but we've had the Jimmy Savile case. It's hard to explain to people in the United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, elsewhere, just how big Jimmy Savile was back in the 70s and 80s. Imagine if this was Johnny Carson. If Johnny Carson was shown to be one of the most prolific and disgusting pedophiles that ever walked the face of the earth. That's the impact that the Savile story has had on these islands. Savile was also a popular star in Ireland too. Savile was also famous for his charity work. That became his cover story, his carrier wave. Just like the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati used mysticism as a cover story, he used charity walks, reckoned to have raised £50 million for charity. But it goes deeper than just a sex scandal. Because one thing I've learned about psychopaths is, when they're waving their hand over here to the left, you have to turn your hand to the right. And when they launch a story as astoundingly spectacular as one of their most popular TV presenters of the 70s and 80s is one of the biggest pedophiles in the history of Britain, that's a clear-fire indication that the story does not end there. The story goes deeper. And that's why they're putting all these sex scandals out there. I think most of them are bogus, to be honest with you. Or they're just playing the hype up. There's probably people who are just looking for money. In the case of Savile, they're trying to create a smokescreen, because I believe, many others believe, that Savile did much, much worse than molest children, teenagers, and have sex with dead bodies. People wonder why conspiracy theorists exist. Why we have conspiracy theory. The reason why we have conspiracy theory is because journalism is dead. Mainstream journalism is dead. And conspiracy theory is filling the vacuum. That's the reason why. Our journalists today, firstly, they're not our journalists, they're the journalists of the corporations and the governments who employ them, literally only regurgitate government corporate and university press releases. That's all they do. They don't even editorialize them anymore. They certainly don't, challenge them. They deliver them. They deliver information to change our will. When I first woke up back in the 70s and 80s, well, no, I wasn't 70s, I was probably a bit too young then. Say the early 80s, I'd say about 81, 82. One of the people that really inspired me all through the 80s and all through the 90s was the journalist David A. Yallop. He wrote a phenomenal book, which if you ever want to wake anyone up, just give them this book. It's called In God's Name. It's about the murder of John Paul I, the Pope who lived for 33 days, the Roberto Calvi, the Vatican banker, being found hanged from a bridge in London after he tried to get refuge in the London Masonic Temple, and basically showed that secret societies, corruption, gangsters and mafia, and corporations and governments, and in the highest ranks of religion, really do exist. So if anyone you know doesn't believe in conspiracy theory, don't show them a video of Alex Jones dressed up like the Joker from Batman, waving his arms around and screaming. Give them a book like In God's Name by David Yallop and just tell them to read it. And it will open up their minds to a world that even at the time wasn't properly reported. David Yallop, I was going through my library. I've got a lot of books in my library. I was going through one of my older books when the news came out that Jimmy Savile was also a suspect in the Yorkshire Ripper case. And he had a book published as the case was happening, it was published in 1981 called Deliver Us from Evil. He was one of the journalists to go in there and do what was, even though it's a paperback book, it's a scholarly study of the case because he was there on the ground as it was happening. Jimmy Savile, I believe, was an accomplice of Peter Sutcliffe, the man, if you can call him that, the monster, who was eventually arrested and charged with the murders of 13 women. That didn't only take place in Yorkshire, they also took place in Lancashire as well, which is why this should not be called the Yorkshire Ripper. It's a misleading term. If you really wanted to give it a name, yeah, I know it's kind of tabloidy, but it's what I'm using at the moment. I would say these murders were committed by the 666 Rippers. The reason why is they all took place along a corridor between Preston and Lancashire, the M61 to Manchester, and then the M62 through Huddersfield, Halifax, Bradford, and Leeds, where the majority of killings took place. 666. The 3 roads were 6, had 6 in them. These murders and assaults, some of these women lived, took place between 1975 and 1980. Now, the case is interesting. I'm not going to go into details about the grisly deaths of these poor women, only when it's specific to what I'm talking about today, because we should let it rest in peace. And I don't believe these things should be really regurgitated for titillation, but there's something really big here because we're getting an insight into just what's running Britain. And I'm not just saying this is Britain's problem. This is going on in every country of the world. And just how bad these psychopaths are. I'm fully under the belief now that the British establishment that knew that Jimmy Savile was an accomplice in the Yorkshire Ripper case, the 666 Rippers case, and they protected him, and they did this by causing absolute chaos in the investigation on numerous levels. This all began for me, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe longer, when Louis Theroux on the BBC did a special where he would go around and meet celebrities, and he spent time with Jimmy Savile. And I was sitting there watching it with a friend, just like watching it. I never liked Jimmy Savile as a kid. I didn't like his shows. I liked Top of the Pops only because I liked the bands and the music. I didn't like him or his other show, Jim Will Fix It. But I was watching the show, and they went to visit his mother's home in Scarborough. His mother had died in 1973, and he showed the wardrobe of the mother's clothes, and all her dresses, whom we call the Duchess, by the way, her dresses were impeccably cleaned every year and folded away. And the first thing I said to my friend was, he's a sex killer. This is long before anything came out. That was the first thing that came to my head, because there was such a shortage of books dealing with non-criminal psychopaths when I was studying it back in the 90s, that I often looked at novel books dealing with criminal psychopathology, because it was the only place you could get really good information through criminal psychologists and so on, who've written books about serial killers. And one thing that all psychopaths have, both the non-violent and the violent ones, is they have an OCD kind of ritual lifestyle, where they like to relive their wins, because this is the only thing like a psychopath knows they're alive. They know they're alive because they get a rush of adrenaline whenever they pull a fast one. When they pull a fast one on a person by making a fool of them, stealing their money, or taking their life. Ted Bundy said he used to feel like God when he would see the life drain out of a woman he was killing. And the minute I saw that, I said to my friend, half jokingly I might add at the time, oh, he's absolutely a sex killer. That's a sex killer. That's the kind of thing a sex killer does. The ritual, the same reason why a psychopathic arsonist will return to the fire after he said it. And that's how they're often caught, because they try to boast about it, to pretend they were heroes. The psychopaths have a heroic nature. Now, also in that Louis Theroux documentary, psychopaths have a peculiar way of saying things. They don't use language the way the rest of us do. This is because of the way they use their brains are quite different. Now, this is before the sex aspect, the sexual perversion and pedophilia aspect of Savile became known. And this language fascinated me, the way he used it. Louis Theroux said, Jimmy, how come you've never had a woman in your life? Why are you living alone? And the term he used was, women are brain damage. Women are brain damage. That will become significant later on. He showed around this house, and we were introduced to this character called, I can't remember his name, but the guy was Jimmy the something. This guy was what psychopaths all have, are fixers. They get them out of trouble. They arrange things for them, often debase things, and they get well paid. All politicians have, psychopathic politicians have, fixers. They're a kind of a super enabler, that a powerful psychopath with a lot of money will find someone to actually facilitate them. Now, I'm not saying this guy did that, but that's the impression I got looking at him. He looked like a male version of a gangster's moll. So then the documentary went further, and Savile referred to his bed, which was very strangely made up, with it looked like a sort of a cross between 1970s nouveau riche tack and Victorian, with a kind of a bizarre canopy in the shape of a triangle, a diamond, or no triangle above it. It looked like a temple, and he referred to the bed as the altar. And Louis Theroux jokingly said, well, we all know what happens on altars. People are sacrificed. The Ripper murders took place between, I said, 75 and 1981. At least 13 women were murdered, although David A. Yallop speculates it may have been many more. The same killer may have killed, or killers may have killed people in Sweden, in Gothenburg, and in the south of France. Savile became, quote unquote, a friend with Sutcliffe and regularly visited Sutcliffe at prison. Again, this asks serious questions. There are other aspects here too as well. It's now come out that Savile was a suspect at the time. That the police actually took his teeth marks, because many of the victims were actually savaged, like using the teeth in that kind of animalistic way, which is barely worth even thinking about. There was another reason in the documentary that set alarm bells off for me as well. There was a scene where Savile was traveling on a cruise ship, and he told Louis Theroux, I only take one pair of underpants with me and I wash them every night. The suspects in the Ripper case, it was established earlier on, now this is quite disgusting, but this is significant, that they were a secretor, meaning that they passed blood in semen and urine. Savile was washing his underpants every night to hide the evidence, and this went on forever. And also would have provided a thrill for him, because he would have remembered what he did with Sutcliffe when they drove around together on the 666 route. I believe that Savile actually took part in some of these murders, and I'm trying to find out at the moment does he have an alibi? Because there's lists of the hosts of Top of the Pops on certain nights during that period. And Savile seems to be missing or available during the nights of many of these murders. When Savile was finished, according to my opinion, understanding how these creatures work, he drove up the M62 to Leeds and then went on the A1237 and then the A64 up to Scarborough where his mother lived. And there, I assume, God knows what he did, but it probably involved his mother's clothes. Again, a psychopathic, demented sex killer. That's why the clothes were washed every year, not as a memorial to his mother, but as a memento of his activities, shall we put it, involving his fixer and enabler and co-psychopathic perverted killer, Sutcliffe, who I also believe is a Freemason if you look at some of the photographs of him shaking hands. Without going too much detail of the murders, the women were hit with a hammer on the back of the head. That's how they were killed. It was a hammer, a specific kind of hammer, the hammer used by metal workers. It has like a ball on the back, rather than a claw for removing nails. The women died of brain damage. What did Savile said? Women are brain damage. This is an enormous red flag. Now, why was the investigation a catastrophe? There was an individual called Detective George Oldfield, I think was his name, of the West Yorkshire Police. And he was the predominant, shall we say, overseer, main detective, the main buddy who was trying to get the so-called Ripper. Initially, the whole thing was that these were murders of just prostitutes. That this killer was a prostitute killer, and this was the predominant notion until a woman who wasn't a prostitute was killed, and then that threw the case into chaos. The detective team should have been immediately removed from the case, but instead they were given far more powers. They were given far more powers because their inability to actually catch this guy, develop a proper criminal profile, was becoming to somebody and something a useful mechanism, because they wanted this case to be chaos, because they did not want the real Ripper or the number of Rippers, who they were, to be found. This is why they interviewed Sutcliffe and let him go 11 times. Oldfield also took part in what was probably the greatest wild goose chase in the history of police investigations. When a tape purporting to be the voice of the Ripper showed up on his desk, was posted to him, the tape was extremely interesting in that it had what they didn't expect. The voice was that of somebody it was posted from Sunderland in the northeast of England. And it was posted by somebody speaking what seems to be on the surface a Northern England, Geordie, Northumbria, Sunderland kind of accent. The tape was sent in a cassette single box. Now, at the time, cassette singles were quite rare. Cassette singles, nobody really bought cassette singles. They weren't that available in the shops. People still bought 7-inch singles. But who did have cassette singles was DJs. They were often sent, these cassette singles were sent to DJs because they made them easier to queue up a cassette song and play the song by putting a cassette into the machine rather than spinning records. So it's highly probable that this cassette single originated from a DJ on the radio. It was a song by a singer called Andrew Gold, and at the end, Andrew Gold is interesting as well because there's a clue in that as well. Remember, psychopaths are very ritualistic, very, they like to play games, they like to play mind games, they like to mess with people's heads. And this tape sent to George Oldfield, it didn't sound particularly like a Geordie or Sunderland accent. It almost sounded like somebody faking it. And from my own listening to it, it sounds like it was recorded at a lower speed, I mean tape speed, and then played back at a higher speed to disguise the voice. Now, something really bizarre went on with this tape. It became almost like a religious call to prayer in Yorkshire. Oldfield, the detective, was obsessed with this tape being played constantly. The tape is constantly played. You could walk into a pub, you could walk into a nightclub. They were even playing it over the sound system in factories. It was constant. It was constantly being played, this tape, which there was no proof it came from the original, from the killer, except that one part where the voice, which seems like a monotonal fake Geordie accent, says, "You're no nearer to catching me now than 4 years ago." If you can find this voice online, it sounds just like Jimmy Savile trying to put on a Geordie accent. Then the case took a very strange turn. Rather than everyone focusing on catching these killers, it became a kind of a social engineering option. It became a means to change British society. Because you see, politicians are very good at this. We all know that. When they want change, there's nothing like a war or a terrorist attack or anything else to allow them to bring in cultural changes, to change the fabric of a society. All these tapes constantly playing, all the women in Yorkshire and Lancashire being portrayed, particularly the working class women, as prostitutes. This was literally a kind of a subtext that was flying around at the time, that single women out after dark in working class areas were automatically being deemed as prostitutes. This, coupled with the fact that the police seemed more interested in portraying women as prostitutes rather than catching the Ripper, made a lot of women very, very angry, and also made a lot of women very anti-man. There were numerous cases, because of this mass hysteria that was being whipped up of this man who was going around killing women, that women began to suspect their own husbands, their boyfriends, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sons, for the most trivial of reasons. Women were saying, "My husband is the Ripper." "How do you know he's the Ripper?" "We had an argument last night." And then the police were following up the investigation on these absurd, hysterical and pathetic behaviors born out of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria causes people, during a mass hysteria, an episode of mass hysteria, not only will you find out who your true friends are, but you'll find out who the real head cases are. The ones that hide behind a hoity-toity lady of the manor or lord of the manor, or, I'm Mr. Respectable or I'm Mrs. Respectable. The real beast will come out during these mass hysteria episodes. And the control system loves this because it puts them in control. So the media hysteria was constantly whipped up, and then men hatred reached an extreme. Men who were obviously not the Ripper were being tailed with vast police resources, particularly in South Yorkshire, under the orders of Oldfield, who should have been thrown off the case by this point, but seemed to be getting more and more power. Scotland Yard in London had the resources to go up there because they were the only ones at the time that had the really cutting-edge, state-of-the-art ability to find out who the Ripper was, and they didn't seem particularly interested. It all descended into constant chaos. The BBC sent up a TV crew who made a documentary series called Man Alive. How's that for a series? A psyop. A BBC documentary series going up to cover the murders of innocent women in the north of England. It was called Man Alive. There's a giveaway for you. And they went up there and basically reported that the police were being very secretive, that the police were being unorthodox in how this case was being handled. But lo and behold, they say, well, they're going about it the right way. They're going about it the right way. As this hatred of men in the north of England gathered, Who steps in but the feminists? They start descending on places like Leeds. Now, we all know feminists don't actually care about women. What they really care about is destroying men. And this because they've been invented by the actual aristocrats to destroy the traditional family structure so the state can actually run people more effectively than the local culture. So if you destroy men and women's relationships with each other, then it's easier to destroy the whole culture. Same thing with children and their parents. So the feminists came from, the stately home socialist feminists from Cambridge and the home counties in London, descended upon Leeds and places like this and had marches. And, the whole atmosphere was men are evil, men are evil, men are killing women, men are killing women. And it destroyed the fabric of the bond between men and women in these communities, which apparently had lasted for many years later. They got their social change they needed. The psychopaths in charge never miss an opportunity. At the same time, they weren't going to stitch Savile up for several reasons. One, he was extremely useful. His TV show, Jim Will Fix It. Looking at it now, it's a very bizarre program, but at the time, it was a hugely successful Saturday evening show where children would ask Jim through letters, can you fix it for me to meet this pop star or meet this film star or do something wacky like eat a jam sandwich on a roller coaster. And the show also featured bizarre requests by children who wanted to meet the Prime Minister or the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Lord Mayor of London or someone else connected with officialdom and bureaucracy. Now, no 9-year-old child writes letters saying, can I meet the head of Watford County Council or whatever. But these are the kind of bizarre things they had on these shows, and became a huge publicity stunt for politicians, where you could have someone like Margaret Thatcher meeting children, and she didn't seem like a beast. She seemed like a nice lady, which she doesn't. She seems like someone who doesn't know how to handle these children. She's talking to them almost like they're an affection or something. Very patronizing. And while this is going on, Jimmy Savile knew the power he had because he was helping these politicians. These psychopaths are very devious. Very, very devious. And so Savile was useful to them. Savile was a great publicity outlet for the elite, the aristocrats, the elite, the politicians. He was very useful, highest rated show. And it's now turned out that many of the kids on the shows who had made these requests to meet the likes of Margaret Thatcher and other politicians were actually kids taken from acting schools, from children's acting schools, and given scripts to read out, pretending that they wanted to meet these politicians. So they were not going to take down Savile, not at that point. And if they were going to try and bust him on lesser charges. Now, his connection to the case is all over the place. Not only was he friends with Sutcliffe afterward, but one of the victims was found outside the Royal Infirmary Hospital in Manchester on the grounds, where Savile was a constant visitor doing his charity work, which we now know is feeling up patients who were comatose and handicapped children and having sex with dead bodies. That's not to put down the staff at the Royal Infirmary Hospital in Manchester. Remember, he was a psychopath. He would have been doing it on the sly, blackmailing people, played as a celebrity, and I'm sure the people at the hospital didn't facilitate him in it. They were their victims too, remember. Also, at the back of Savile's flat in Leeds, one of the victims was found, and she was a significant victim because in the grounds where the body was found, they found the tire marks of Sutcliffe's car, and the body had been moved several times around and almost placed in a ritualistic manner within spitting distance of Savile's apartment, and Savile was absolutely home that evening. Between the teeth marks, the fact he was a secretor, two of the murders taking place in close proximity to Savile, he was already well known as a sex freak at the time. He should have been pulled in. He wasn't. Everybody else in the north of England was a suspect except Savile. Everyone else was in fear of being arrested and being brought to a police station and framed by Oldfield and the other members of the West Yorkshire Police, with the crime of the century. Savile continued on his merry way, driving along the 666 corridor and then making his escape via the A1237 and the A64 to Scarborough. In the tape, and in some of the letters that were sent, he talks about, I haven't been north in a while. But yet the letters were sent from Sunderland and the tape, and they were also spoken in a Geordie accent. So when he said, I haven't been north in a while, it makes no sense because it was obviously happening from the north. But remember, what is north of Scarborough? Sunderland. So Sunderland would have been north to Savile. That's what he meant by, I haven't been up north in a while. I haven't been to Sunderland in a while. As I said, Sutcliffe, who absolutely was the killer, but he didn't work alone, was arrested 9 times, interviewed and taken in for questioning 9 times, and released 9 times. The hoax tape was the greatest wild goose chase in the history of criminology. It became a psyop of sorts. Feminists, as the change agents, were brought in to bring forth Tavistock-style policies to create hatred between men and women. And all the time, the victims didn't matter. They just didn't matter. And when Sutcliffe was finally charged and was found guilty but not insane, the police were delighted. If you want to see something that would actually make you vomit, look at Oldfield and the rest of the Yorkshire police detectives, the senior ones, like giddy school children, delighted that the case has now been closed. And the Yorkshire Ripper is behind bars, giving no consideration to the families who lost their mothers, sisters, daughters, to the numerous children. Many, many children lost their mothers because of Sutcliffe and Savile. But they were delighted not because Sutcliffe was behind bars, but because Savile was safe. They'd done their job. The control system were delighted. Savile could still work for them. The agents of change were still in control. And Britain and the north of England would never be the same again. Relationships between men and women were broken. A state of paranoia and fear still exists that many women didn't believe that the actual Ripper had been caught for years afterwards. They still believed another one was out there, as did David Yallop, who claims that the murders continued somehow or someone else was involved. And that person, in my opinion, was the TV presenter, paedophile on an industrial scale, and perhaps one of the most evil creatures that ever walked this earth to attain that kind of power. And that was Jimmy Savile. So, we're going to go to a song here. This is the final song. And we'll try and cheer things up a bit after this song. But this is Time Wars, A Wild Nobility. Time War, A Wild Nobility. Great tune, that. The last half hour of the show, I want to do a few little kind of, potlucky kind of things here. Again, this is Thomas Sheridan. You're listening to the velocity of now, the media that will eventually replace the media, because that's my intention. I know other people feel the same way. If you want to get rid of the garbage that is the mainstream media and replace it with a media that will actually be meaningful in people's lives in terms of empowering them, educating them, being useful, putting their destiny back in their own hands and taking it away from the control grid. Anything you can do to support this program would be fantastic. The website is www.thomassheridanarts.com. You can buy any 3 of my books there. They're listed on the home page. If not, you can drop. You don't like reading or you don't want to read, you can send me a few shekels in the donate button. But believe me, everything helps, because it's reached a crucial point now where I can either just vanish or keep on going. Don't make a lot of money from my books. I don't make anything really from my speaking, and I just basically make survive. But as I'm becoming very popular, my website is getting tremendous amounts of hits. It's taken up a lot of time, and money. So anything you can do to help, no matter how small, would be greatly appreciative. And I thank the people who gave me some money last week. It all adds up, no matter how small. It does help, and it does keep me on the air, and it does keep this my end of the alternative media going. Because that's ultimately what it is. It's a battle for human consciousness, and if we can change the media, I believe we'll change everything else. Because literally we'll have a culture change from that point on. And this is why it's so important. Why it's so important that we become researchers, we become knowledge seekers, we become skeptics, and we become decent. That we have decency. There's an awful lot of sniping and stabbing on internet forums and so on, and it's not helping anyone. If you disagree with someone and you think they're a muppet or a pain in the ass, just ignore them. That's always been my thing. Just ignore people who are just obviously, winding you up. And always keep a sense of humor. Always keep a smile on your face. And just because we're creating a new culture doesn't mean we have to reject the old. We don't have to look down on our neighbors, call them sheeple. We don't have to look down on people and call them, think of them as being, not as smart as us. We can still go to the pub, hang out with them, have conversations about trivial matters, and sneak in some alternative knowledge and research, now and again, rather than bombarding them like in an evangelical kind of a way. So with that, I want to start, we had 3 songs. I'm going to feature at least 3 bands, unsigned bands every week, and that to expand people's musical horizons, as well as to give those bands, a good plug. Apparently I'm getting decent listenership on the show. If the YouTube hits and the hits onto my site are anything to go by. And so we're all helping each other. We're all in this together, and let's do it. Now, a big part of this is to stop watching YouTube videos, stop constantly believing bogus internet news sites. And anyone can write a blog, anyone can write an article. It's good also, and they're good too. There's lots of gold in there also. But it's good to read books. It's good to, go to the library and go to the bookshops. This is the golden age of book collecting, by the way, because Kindle Fire and Kindles and so on, and all kinds of tablets have made a bonanza for us old-fashioned book collectors to get our hands on some paper in some bricks and mortar bookshops. And there's phenomenal bargains out there on this online in the bookshops, even secondhand stalls. I'm just in the last month or so I've just got about 30 or 40 new books. Obviously I can't read them all, but I'm giving you reviews basically of books that I read a while back or read recently that I think you should read. And they'll be dealing with all kinds of subjects, the esoteric, political, how language is used, psychology, psychiatry, alchemy, mysticism, everything really, history, you name it. So I'm not going to do it all. But the first of the 3 I'm recommending today is The Courage to Create by Rollo May. This is quite a well-known book from the 1960s. The Courage to Create. What is the one quality possessed by all geniuses? How can we acquire creative courage? and what takes place in the creative instant, how we can create power, make your life richer and more satisfying. What I love about this book is that it's the way he writes it, and his quotations are phenomenal. And he basically understands that what it is to be an artist or a creative person is really a form of courage. It's a form of courage that causes you to break the mold. And that was beautifully encapsulated in this quote from James Joyce's book, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, where the young hero writes into his diary, Stephen Dedalus, the young hero, writes, "Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." Basically meaning that the universe is built with every act of creativity. Doesn't matter what it is, from creating a child to creating a home, to building a custom car, to painting a picture, to writing a novel, to creating a website. You're rebuilding and you're creating the universe going forward. And this takes an awful lot of courage to do this. Some of us, like myself, it kind of comes naturally because creativity was all I had when I was a kid. I had nothing else. I grew up very poor, so that was my way. But also, he talks about the dangers of being a creative person, that you'll invoke the jealousy of the gods. People who are not creative will tend to attack you. People who are creative tend to die young. You look at all the pop stars who died young: Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, numerous actors, Valentino, and so on, James. And whatever their names were, they'd all died young. They died young because they invoked the ire of the gods. And that doesn't mean it literally happens. It means that creativity is a challenge that you put up to the universe, but the universe puts that challenge right back at you. To see if you were to, it's almost kind of like a rite of passage. And in the modern age, in particular in the West, where we don't have rites of passage like we do have in indigenous cultures, where young boys of 12 and 13 are sent out into the wild to survive on their own. Generally, our rite of passage is the ability to create, put ourselves out there in public, and to be judged. And the Courage to Create by Rollo May is a book that talks about this process in a very easy to read manner, in a very enthusiastic, a very positive, and a very inspiring way. It'll actually make you want to create, because it shows you the power of it with the unconscious. He talks about Jung. He talks about the Delphic Oracle as a therapist in terms of the creative soul, manifesting new ideas from that. And also, very important, he talks about the limits of creativity. People think that there are no limits to creativity. Well, there is. Your limitations, are not only what exists within your physical body. You might say to yourself, I want to win the World Cup, score the winning goal at the World Cup, win the gold medal at the 100-meter sprint, and become the heavyweight boxing champion. You can't do that. Well, the same thing exists within your creative limitations, that you're limited to only, a certain amount, because otherwise you overextend yourself and you will invoke the jealousy of the gods. And that can manifest as ego gone wild, drug addiction, or just selling out. That's a common one. And then you're not creating anymore. You're just becoming a robot who's providing a service. And often that service will be for people who will just use your talents in order to manipulate and exploit others. The Courage to Create by Rollo May. The second book is a book that many people in the alternative movement would probably avoid, but just like I tell people to go and read Richard Dawkins' books and read books by people who are hardcore skeptics, it's good to cross-reference and check yourself. And I bought this book called The Believing Brain by Michael Shermer. It's The Believing Brain, From Spiritual Faiths to Political Convictions, How We Construct Beliefs and Reinforce Them as Truths. Now, this guy is, he's a psychologist and a science historian, and he's quite conservative. He's definitely from the Dawkins end of things. He's one of these types that, even though he's a psychologist, he's one of these types. You should really be a psychiatrist, in that His beliefs are extremely conservative. What is, what the media tells us is the media tells us. And, you can read these books. You don't have to believe them. You can step back and see how the other side thinks, because we should approach these things almost like espionage. We should see how the other side thinks. That's why I encourage people. When people were saying years ago, Saul Alinsky, Evil, Rules for Radicals, an evil book he dedicated to Lucifer. I was telling people, get out there and read that book, because this is what they're using against us, and it's working. So you have to learn how they operate, and also then use those tools yourself. Like the fluoride event in Dublin last week, using public relations, just like Bernays, to win the battle back for our size. So The Believing Brain by Michael Shermer, I got that for this reason. Now, some of the stuff in it is quite silly how close-minded he is. He doesn't believe anything, and he also has that obnoxious trait where some of these types automatically, try to attach like conspiracy theory to anti-Semitism, or conspiracy theory to anti-Catholics, or conspiracy theory to anti-gays and stuff like that. So he has a bit of that element going on. But having said that, there's tremendous stuff about how the brain works, how psychology works, things like confirmation bias, very interesting things. How the brain formats beliefs, where it just expects to see things that don't exist, like where simulacra comes in and you see shapes that aren't real, where you see an image. Like I have an example of this on my website where I took a picture of a fish in a seafood restaurant in here in Ireland, and the fish's head and the angle I put it looks kind of like a grey alien from the side, or some kind of alien creature. And it's just a way of showing that your brain will fill in the beliefs packages, especially if there's a voice telling you that this is what it is. So it's very, not only should you be researching the alternative and the sort of like the activist information independently, but also look at how the other side thinks. And this book just basically showed me that we have a very easy battle on our hands, because the other side are so conservative. Oh my God. And they're so entrenched in that left brain sort of like, dogma, that they're going to be so easy to take down by just like subverting them through creativity, being clever, and using their own PR against them. But the book has some great stuff on how the brain works, how perception works, all useful stuff. You should know these things. Remember, these people are not our enemies. They're just the other side of the coin, and they have useful stuff to teach us. Just like when a relationship fails, instead of like hating the person that forever, learn from it to understand yourself. So you're not like constantly saying, oh, they're bad or they're evil, because there's a learning experience in everything that goes wrong in your life. There's no, like as Bob Ross used to say, there's no such thing as mistakes. There's only happy accidents. That's the second book, The Believing Brain, From Spiritual Faith to Political Convictions, How We Construct Beliefs and Reinforce Them as Truths by Michael Shermer. And the final book is another one that's mainstream as well, but boy, is it great. It's called Unspeak Trademark by Stephen Poole. This is a great book. It talks about how language is used to enslave us and attack us, how language is used to put the confirmation bias in our head. And he's very critical of how politicians behave and speak. Now, I think he's kind of a right-wing guy in America, and he's basically saying that like liberals are, but not always, are like, Orwellian, controllers and so on. Doesn't matter. Again, don't be closing your mind off to someone who has a tag or a label. There's something to learn from everybody. I'll just read you a section here from Unspeak. Why the name Unspeak? It is an attempt to capture the Janus-like nature of such language. On the one hand, a phrase like pro-life carries with it a whole unspoken argument that a fetus should be considered a person, that life must be preserved in all situations, that it does not set out explicitly. It represents an attempt to say something without saying it, without getting into an argument, and without having to justify itself. At the same time, it tries to unspeak in the sense of erasing or silencing any possible opposing point of view by laying a claim right at the start to not only one way of looking at a problem in terms of life rather than choice, or in terms of tax as something to be relieved rather than, say, a way of contributing to society in terms of tax relief. Now all language does both of these things to some extent. Every word arrives at the ear cloaked in a mist of associations and implications, and every choice of a particular word represents a decision not to use another word. But unspeak deliberately amplifies and exploits these properties of language for political motives. Fabulous. The whole book is like that. You can pick all these books up so easy now. Unspeak is a weapon. That's what it talks about. It uses terms that politicians and spin doctors use and shows that they're actually weapons: pro-life, natural resources, Operation Iraq Freedom. The same thing, that it, to counteract what they're saying, automatically puts you in a bad position. And it means that you have to actually justify your own humanity or your own conscience or your own beliefs before you can actually get to discussing the item at hand. Very, very sneaky, very evil. And he shows this, in a brilliant way, in a very easy to read way. So that's Unspeak by Stephen Poole. 3 books I'll recommend this week. If you can find them on eBay, I'll put links to what they are. If you want to buy the new ones on Amazon, even better. Keep the authors pay their bills, or look for them, whatever, in secondhand bookshops. But that's, constantly educate yourself, constantly read, feed the brain. Don't be sitting in a room full of UFO books or, ghost books and, conspiracy books and think you know it all. You don't know it all. Just like the person who sits there with Dawkins books and science books, he doesn't know it all, or she doesn't know it all either. The idea is to develop a holistic approach to knowledge seeking, to develop a holistic approach to developing ourselves as people and living in what is the velocity of now. That's the title of this show. Right now is traveling at a speed, a certain velocity, and how that velocity moves along is completely dependent on the speed that you set it at. You control the speedometer. You do not have to go with the flow. You do not have to ride the wave. You do not have to be sheeple 2.0. You do not have to allow yourself to be carried along by mass hysteria and peer pressure. The greatest word in the English language is no. No, I will not comply with your fascist regime. No, I will not sit down and let you put sodium fluoride in the water. No, I will not let you demean my integrity and my intellect by referring to me as a conspiracy theorist. Laugh out loud. No, I am not choosing between blacks and whites. No, I am not choosing between gays and straights. No, I am not being on the black square or the white square of the chessboard. I'm getting off the chessboard and I'm going to set my own tempo, live my own life my own way, and create things according to how I see them and how it will work best for me. And if I screw up and make mistakes along the way, it doesn't make me a moron. It doesn't make me a fool. It means I just made a mistake, and it's how you process that mistake is what you really learn from. And so I want to thank you for this coming here for the second episode of The Velocity of Now. I was a lot more relaxed this week than last week. Sorry about the problem at the beginning. I forgot to send the producers the theme music. That was my fault. And we'll probably have it at the end because it's a piece of music I really like. I just wrote it one night, and it kind of sums up how I was feeling about the world. My website again is thomassheridanarts.com. You get links there to my blogs and lots of information there. You can friend me on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter. And I like meeting people. That's the main reason I go do speaking tours. I love to meet people. I love to gauge how people are. And I love to gauge the changes. And I see a lot of positive stuff. I see a lot of healthy skepticism. I see people within the alternative and the activist community challenging the activist community, but not in a divisive way. They're trying to rout out the shills. God bless them, because the shills do exist. I've had my trouble with them. They've tried to take me down, but they won't take me down. And because the reason why they won't take me down is there's a fact that they sent out the shills in the first place, because we've already won. We've already passed the finish line. We've already got there, and we've already put this psychopathic system out of business. The only thing is that they don't know it yet, but we know it, and that's all that matters. And one day they're going to wake up and find out that there's a whole world that's completely different than the one that they foisted upon us. And they're going to be foisting it upon nobody, because we, the human race, who evolved to the next level, have brought our creativity, our compassion, our decency, and our inability to reject fascism, bullies, cults, dogma, and other restraints upon us. We just have simply walked away. And we do that by living in the velocity of now, no compliance and no contact ever again with pathological individual systems and people. I'm Thomas Sheridan. This is the velocity of now. Thanks very much for joining me for the second show, and I'll see you this time next week. Take care, and remember, second if they can take,